Whew, 2020 is almost over. Hallelujah. Good riddance. This has been a crazy year. You might not even can remember all that happened. I won't go over it all, but you remember way back last January that we were in the midst of an impeachment trial? That overseas, Britain was trying to pull something called a Brexit that just now finally came to be. And this word COVID, we had yet to hear. It was around February that it actually got a name, and we began to hear a little bit about it. In our country, there was racial unrest. Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old young man, was killed while jogging in his own neighborhood. Shortly after that, in March, Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old young woman, a paramedic, was shot to death in her own apartment. And then we heard of George Floyd, and we remember the picture of the knee on his neck and the words, "I can't breathe." And our black brothers and sisters began to ask us, do our lives matter? In the midst of all of this political tension and all of this beginning to worry medically about what might happen, there were natural disasters. Do you remember that there have been so many hurricanes this year that they ran out of names and had to start using the Greek alphabet? There were wildfires throughout the world, and in California, especially here in our nation. There were floods throughout the world, but here in our nation in Michigan, there were much destruction. There were earthquakes. We even felt one here in Statesville. In the midst of thinking of all of this crazy year, in the midst of preaching through our beautiful stained glass windows, you might say, well, Pastor, what stained glass window captures 2020? Why, it's right there. We call it the flight to Egypt. It's a picture that when you first look at it, seems like such a sweet scene, doesn't it? There is Mary and Joseph holding Jesus, who has grown a little bit but still seems to be a toddler. And Mary's riding the donkey, perhaps the one that took her to Bethlehem. And it's just a sweet picture of this family on this trip. But look closer. Do you see the face and eyes of Mary looking at the child in great, great concern? Do you see Joseph, who is coming close in to his family out of fear? What is really going on in this picture? It's not such a sweet scene. It is a harrowing scene. It is harrowing. It is something that's happening to our Lord and his family. We know that the Magi, the wise men as we call them, have come to find the King of the Jews. And they go to Herod and ask about this, where he might be born. And you know the story, how Herod begins to plot, and the Magi warned to go home a different way. And the angel comes and warns Joseph that he must flee the wrath of Herod. You see, Jesus was born into days of adversity. Jesus knew threats on his life from the moment he was born to the moment he gave his own life upon the cross. Herod was perhaps the cruelest ruler, or one of the cruelest that ever lived. He had a wife named Miriam. She was the one he loved best of all of his wives. He had several. He loved her so much, you know what he did? He killed her. He was so in love, he said, that he was worried that he might lose her love, and so he just executed her. 2 of his own sons he killed. In fact, Roman Emperor Augustus is quoted as saying, it would be better to be one of Herod's pigs than to be one of his sons. What an awful thing to say. This is the type of ruler that was over the area where Jesus was born. And he came up with this horrible, horrible plan because he was worried about this new king. He ordered that all of the boy children, and that whole area, be slaughtered. It is called the massacre of the innocents. I can't stand to think of even one child losing his life or her life, much less hundreds. Can you imagine the pain that was in that area at that time? That is why Matthew tells us about Jeremiah's prophecy, that a voice is heard from Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. What a horrible story to have in the midst of Christmas, but here it is. This stained glass window is a picture of Jesus as a refugee. You want to see those kind of pictures today? They're in the news as well. Look at refugees around the world. Look at children who are running from poverty, who are running from war. It goes on even today. Mary and Joseph were peasants. They had little means. Yes, the Magi brought them gifts, and that perhaps helped them to make this trip to Egypt. But when they got there, they would know no one. Where would they go? What would they do? The only reason they went to Egypt was because it was out of Herod's control. And even when Herod died and they were told to come back, it was still not safe to go to Judea, for his son was there and was just as bad. So they went back to Nazareth, that little backwater town. Joseph had to go back and start all over again and reopen his shop. As they came back through Israel, they probably saw horrific sights, for there were uprisings. The crucifixion of Jesus was not the first crucifixion. It was throughout his entire life. He probably, even as a child, had to travel by those who were hanging on crosses. Jesus was known as a man of sorrows. In Isaiah, in those servant psalms like Isaiah 53, Jesus identified with these and the suffering that the Messiah would have to experience. It was a tough, tough time. And what would Jesus do with all of this? Would he be scared? Would he run? Would it scar his life forever? No. Instead of scarring his life, these adversities set a different path for Jesus. Let's look a little bit about how these things affected Jesus. The first thing I want to say today is that Jesus, when he faced adversity, never denied it. Rather, he always faced it head on. Denial is such a strong force in all of us. Usually when something bad happens, our first instinct is just to say, it can't be. We don't want it to be this way. I remember when I first started hearing about COVID, and I remember thinking, well, this is something we'll get through pretty quickly. We had to shut the church down, and I thought, well, that'll only be for a Sunday or two. Surely we'll figure this thing out. Surely maybe in 3 or 4 weeks. And then it was 3 or 4 months. And now we still are in the midst of the worst of it. When racial tensions occurred in our country, I thought, this is no longer the 60s. Surely we as a country are doing better. And yet I would talk to my black brothers and sisters and friends, and they would say, Nelson, wake up. It's still the same. The political polarization that swept through our country, I thought, surely calm voices will prevail. Surely we can solve these problems together. But the first step in solving any problem is to name it. Is to say, it is. It exists. These things are happening to us. When Herod ordered the slaughter of these babies, the angel of the Lord came to Joseph and said, this is happening. This is a tragedy. Get up and take your family and take them to safety. Jesus faced all of these things, whether as a child or as an adult, head on. When Jesus saw oppression, he named it, and he stood up against it. When Jesus saw the poor, his heart went out to them. When he saw the hungry, he fed them. When he saw the sick, he offered healing. When he saw corruption in the temple or in the government that day, he stood against it and said, there must be a better way. You see, Jesus never played the victim. Wouldn't it have been easy for Mary and Joseph to have just kept Jesus down in Egypt? To say, well, we're just going to forget about all that stuff back there. We're just going to hide out here. But the angel said, no, go back. If anyone had the right to play the victim card, it was Jesus. He was perfect in every way. He was sinless. Yet he refused to be a victim of life. He saw rather God's grace. I don't know about you, but this thing of playing the victim is a tempting thing to me and to all of us. We have hurts and we have pains. Things don't go our way. Your child gets in trouble at school. Isn't it easier to say, well, it must be the teacher's fault or it must be those other kids, instead of talking to your child and saying, what are you doing in this? We don't get a promotion at work and we say, well, that must be the system. The boss is against me. A friend cancels dinner on us and we say, well, they must not like me. Poor me. Well, maybe something was going on in their life that we might be concerned about. We've all played the victim. I remember as a child, I used to threaten to run away. Did y'all use that threat ever? I carried it out one time. I went and I was gone for such a long time. And I came back thinking, well, they're going to all appreciate me now. I came back and everything was still happening. Mom was still cooking supper and my sisters were still watching TV and my dad was reading a book, and I came in, I said, I ran away, I'm back. And they all just looked at me and said, well, we thought you were just out playing. My dad looked at me and said, well, Nelson, run away again. We'll try to do better when you come back next time. I learned really quick that wasn't going to work in my family. You couldn't pull this victim card. But there is a reward to playing the victim, isn't there? When we get empathy and sympathy from others, but the problem with it is that in trying to get a sense of control, we end up giving away our control and extending it to others. It comes at a great cost to us. It makes us dependent upon the emotions and the whims of others. We blame everyone else and then we lose our power to deal with what is going on. We get into cycles of negativity. We lose the blessings of today worrying about what might happen tomorrow. We put our lives on hold, waiting for something else to change. We hold grudges against others, not knowing that they're hurting us more than they're hurting anyone else. Every little thing becomes a tragedy to us, and eventually we run everyone else off because they get tired of it. This playing the victim doesn't work. Jesus refused to do that even in the midst of this tragedy. His family sought a way to focus on the situation at hand and to do what they can and to trust God and to follow God, to turn their attention on a world in need. You see, Jesus did learn some lessons even from this early story of having to escape into Egypt. One thing he learned was that he would never forget the oppressed. Jesus knew from his own family what it was like to be sought after, what it was like to live in a world that was out to get you. When Jesus grew and had power and fame, he never forgot the people who were hurting. You know, most folks, when they get a little bit of something in life, forget where they might have come from. Forget those others who are hurting. Researchers at Laurel University in Ontario, Canada, actually did an experiment on this. They had two different groups of people think through and write down either a time that they felt empowered and on top of the world, or a time when they felt they were powerless, when something bad happened to them. While they were doing this, they measured the mirror response, which is a form of empathy. The mirror response is you kind of do what someone else is doing. You see it, we do it naturally, but it's a form of empathy. Someone would squeeze a rubber ball, and you know what happened? Those who were feeling powerless and thinking through those bad times, they would start mimicking that person. In other words, they would empathize. Those who were writing about a time they felt everything was great, they didn't even notice the other people around them. Jesus never forgot. Jesus, through this harrowing story of having to flee to Egypt, did not allow it to scar his life, but instead allowed it to shape his life so that he always cared for the neediest among us. He walked among the poor. He said, the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head. In other words, he chose to be homeless. The book of Philippians, Paul writes and says that Jesus emptied himself of all that he had in heaven. And he came, he took on the form of a servant. When Jesus taught, he taught about the poor and the oppressed. He said, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep, for one day you will laugh. When he looked out and he saw thousands following him and they were hungry, he turned to the disciples. He said, these folks need food. What do you got? And they came up with a little bit of fish and a little bit of bread. And he blessed it and he fed over 5,000. In Luke chapter 7, there is a story of Jesus coming into a town of Nain. And there he sees a funeral procession. There is a widow lady, but it's not her husband she is burying. It is her only child. And Jesus asked about this. And I love the verse in Luke 7 where it says, and the Lord saw her and his heart went out to her. And he said to her, do not cry. And he touched the young man and said, get up. And he brought him back from the dead. Jesus knew what it was like to grieve. And instead of it making his heart hard, it filled him with compassion for those who were hurting. Jesus offered a different path and offers us a different path. Rather than in times of difficulty being paralyzed by fear, or rather going into cycles of victimization or oppression, Jesus says there are ways to break these cycles. Jesus knew that you could stop this stuff. That with love and grace, things could be different. You know the cycle of oppression, the cycles of violence. How those who sometimes are oppressed become the oppressors later on. We've seen it throughout history. Some of you have watched the movies Hunger Games or read the books. If you have, you know that the hero of that story is Katniss Everdeen. She is a teenager. She is called forth to fight in what's called the Hunger Games. It's because the capital was in charge of all things and they oppressed all the other districts. You follow through and she fights for justice. But you remember in the end, when there is a revolt and the capital is overthrown, and those who have been oppressed say, well, let's just reinstitute the Hunger Games. Let's do to them what they did to us. Katniss saw through it, and stopped it. What about us? When we go through difficult times, do we want to lash out at others? Jesus offers a different path for us as Christians and for us as a world. He says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist the evil person. If anyone slaps you, turn to them the right cheek as well. If anyone sues you, wants to take your shirt, give them your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you to love your enemies and pray for even those who persecute you. Jesus didn't just say those words. Jesus practiced what he preached. He rejected all forms of violence and oppression, and he refused to assume power over others and to lord it over them, but rather he emptied himself until he gave his own life in God's good time. You see this window which looks so beautiful and looks so innocent is really about the slaughter of the innocents. Do you think that's the last time that Jesus' life was in danger? Absolutely not. Jesus lived under the threat of death, under the threat of oppression every day of his life. And in the fullness of time, he laid down his life for you and me. Do you think that the cross was the Herods? There were more of them than just the one evil one. They continued on and on, catching up to him. Do you think it was about Rome taking their vengeance? Do you think it was about the high priest and all the religious folks? Oh, yes, they were all ganging up against Jesus, but they could never get him. He chose to give his life for you and me. And because of that, his life continues to make a difference each and every day. How do we remember Herod and those of his ilk? They live, to borrow a word from Roosevelt, in infamy. They live as those who we hold up as the worst examples. Where Jesus, who chose to give his life, lives an example of grace and love and truth, the greatest of all time, the one who loved more than all the hatred that came at him, who upon the cross said, Father, forgive them. They don't even understand what they're doing. We face tough times. We face challenges. We have tragedies that come into our life. We have pain. It's been a difficult year. What will we do with the tragedies that we face? Will we be like Jesus and face them head on? Grieve what we need to grieve. Don't deny them, for these things are happening to us. But don't become a victim either. Take ownership of what we can. Do what we can. Don't blame others, but acknowledge our hurts, but focus on the solutions. Be kind and gentle to ourselves and to others in the midst of these difficult days. Practice gratitude and list our blessings. Forgive others and forgive ourselves as well. But in all of this, focus on doing good. Focus on helping others. Look for God's path. I heard once of two brothers. They both, when they were teens, lost their parents. It's the same parents. It was a tragic car wreck. One brother grew up to become an alcoholic filled with rage. The other said, I want to be an EMT. I want to be those who came to try to rescue Later, he went on to become a nurse and to help others and to work in a hospital setting. We all face these tragedies in our life, some worse than others, but all that affect us. And we have a choice of what they will do to us. Will they propel us to love others and to empathize with others in pain? Will they propel us to seek to be a part of the goodness in life, to live like Christ? I think I've told you before the story of Mr. Rogers. Y'all know Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He was such a kind and sweet person. I heard that when he was a child, he asked his mother one time what to do in times of tragedy. And she said, look for the helpers, for there's someone out there always trying to make it better, and become one of them. When you look at this stained glass picture, remember not only that you can be a helper, but that God is our helper and sustainer through all of life. We're going to come now to a time when we sing a hymn. We call it our hymn of commitment. It's a time when we give our lives afresh and new to Christ. When we open the doors to our church to those who might want to become a part of us. If God is speaking to you, would you make whatever decision God is calling you to make?